Hey there, welcome to the Bible in 5. We are in this video going to be covering 2 Corinthians, which you're going to be reading this week. This is actually not Paul's technically his second letter, but actually like his fourth letter to the Corinthians. So after he wrote his first letter to the Corinthians, right, to help them sort out their problems, he got a report back that there was essentially like a rebellion happening in the church. And there were a bunch of people saying, "Who's Paul to tell us what to do? We don't care about him. He has no authority over us." And so there were a group of teachers and leaders in the church who were essentially leading like a rebellion, a coup against Paul. And so Paul, in response to that, wrote what he describes in 2 Corinthians. He describes it as a severe letter that caused them sorrow. And it was a letter where he was essentially just really challenging them, saying that rebelling against him and his leadership is essentially rebelling against the gospel itself because they have compromised on the gospel and are being disobedient to Christ. And so their response to that was positive. A bunch of people in the church said, "You're right, we are being selfish. Paul is very gracious. He's our leader. God's the one who's appointed him to be our leader for this time." And so after that positive response, Paul wrote this letter that we have right here. And essentially in chapters 1 through 7, Paul is writing to encourage and to say, "I'm sorry that I had to write a severe letter, but you guys it wasn't just that you were, offending me." He said, "Your rebellion against me was actually showing that there's something in your hearts that's not consistent with what it means to be a follower of Jesus." And so he writes this section of the letter to encourage them and to say, "I forgive you, it's okay." And he essentially writes this kind of like to defend his way of leading and so on. And part of what the people who led the rebellion were saying about Paul was like, he's not a trained public speaker, he's not very powerful, he lacks courage. And look at Paul's life. Paul's life was characterized by hardship and suffering. And just read the book of Acts to get the gist of that. And so their basic point, Paul says that this is what they were saying about him, that his suffering and hardship in life must be a sign that God doesn't approve of Paul or his message. And so what Paul has to do in these chapters here of 1 through 7 is say, no, actually it's just the opposite. Because the gospel is the good news about what God did for the world through the cross. Jesus himself suffered hardship so that others could be saved. And so what Paul is doing in this is a very powerful kind of application to of the gospel to daily life. And he says, if you're a follower of Christ, you shouldn't expect like things to go well all of the time. The gospel is about God suffering for our behalf. And so if you're going to be a person of the gospel, then you're going to be a person who's likely going to go through hardship. And God gives you strength through hardship, but suffering and hardship is built into what it means to be a follower of Jesus. It does not discredit the gospel at all. And so he writes this kind of to defend his way of life and his ministry to the Corinthians, that it's not a discredit, but it's actually an authentication of his ministry. And so based off of that, he reminds them of a promise that the Corinthians made. Paul was making a collection among the non-Jewish churches across the Mediterranean, a money collection to send to the poor Christians in Jerusalem. The Corinthians had said they wanted to give to this fund, and so Paul reminds them. He says, "You rejected my authority, but many of you have apologized, and that's great. So don't forget that God wants his people who are being changed by the gospel to be people of generosity." These two chapters are some of the key chapters in the New Testament that talk about financial generosity as a natural part of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. Very powerful chapters here. And then in the final chapters of the book, Paul comes to address directly his opponents in Corinth, the people in Corinth who were still opposed to him and still reject him. And essentially, he returns to the themes of the earlier part of the letter. And he says, if he wanted to, as an apostle, as a former rabbi, he says, I could pull rank on any of you guys in terms of like Bible knowledge, in terms of I've actually seen the risen Jesus, in terms of spiritual experiences that he's had. But he says, I'm not going to do that, because in a community of Jesus, to be a leader or to exercise authority doesn't mean I get to call the shots and tell you to do whatever I want. He says, actually, remember, the gospel is about God's suffering hardship for our benefit. And so he says, as a leader of the church, I'm not going to use my authority to, tell you what to do. I'm actually going to serve you and love you, and through that way be a leader and a servant leader. Very powerful chapters here. And his basic point is that power and authority in a community of Jesus is shown through weakness and service and love, not by claiming your rights and telling other people what to do. And so these are very powerful chapters here, exploring what it means to have influence and how we should behave and treat each other in the church community of Jesus because of the gospel. Very powerful. So 2 Corinthians is one of Paul's most personal letters. It comes right from his heart. He's been hurt by these people. They've reconciled. And so he's exploring how the gospel should heal relationships, redefine how we think about suffering and generosity and power and leadership. So very practical, a lot of very powerful sections here in the letter. So I hope you enjoy it. See you next time.